Hello, everyone. If you enjoy the story, please consider supporting the author by going to the link in the description to Amazon to pre-order the book for yourself. It costs 99 cents and it'll be out on April 20th for you to enjoy on any of your electronic devices. JD was lying unconscious on an operating table. I had just seen him a few minutes earlier when he ran out of an OR that held a very angry corpse of Dr. Brutson. And here he lay, unconscious and ashen-faced, looking for all the world like a deflated balloon. A young nurse was the only other person in the room. "What happened?" I asked. "Don't know. The patient is monitorized, and we're waiting for an ECG readout. BP is 10/6 and dropping. No external lacerations, no signs of internal bleeding or trauma." I grabbed my hair and pulled tightly. JD wasn't a patient, and this suffering made no sense. Just like Brutson's agony and death, or Myron's inexplicable autocannibalism. I wanted to scream and punch the wall, then curl up in the janitor's closet. So I closed my eyes, breathed in, and counted to 3. Compartmentalize. I opened my eyes and understood that a puzzle lay before me. What state was he found in? A janitor came across him lying unconscious on the ground just outside the front door. Have his vitals changed? Not in the past 3 minutes. Grab a ventilator filter and prepare for possible intubation. Yes, doctor. I need to see if I can find... What's wrong? Patient's experiencing ventricular fibrillation. Let's move. Defibrillators ready, doctor. The first surge of electricity lifted his chest several inches from the table. I watched in horror as his mouth opened and his tongue flopped out onto his cheek. That wasn't normal. The second jolt brought him nearly a foot into the air. His fingers danced and jittered before slowly coming to rest by his side, unnaturally straight. My blood chilled as his gray fingers periodically twitched as though seeking an invisible trigger. The nurse blanched. "Patient's not showing any cardiological signs he's been shocked, doctor." I prepped the defibrillator once more, wondering what could happen with the third round. I was ready for anything. I was surprised. I sent 1,000 volts of electricity into JD's heart, and nothing happened. He didn't move, he didn't twitch. Surely none of his vitals showed any signs of life at all. I called time of death on a colleague for the second time that night. 19 minutes after racing out of Dr. Skrutt's office, and 13 minutes after beginning a fruitless attempt at CPR. I dismissed the nurse halfway through so that she might save some patient with a reasonable chance to postpone the inevitable. Once I had accepted defeat, I wiped away tears and snot as I stared down at JD's dead body. That's when he opened his eyes. He had no pupils or irises, only a sea of sad whiteness spread between his lids, vacant and sad and soul-crushingly empty. His lifeless arm grabbed my wrist hard enough to send lightning bolts of pain through my shoulder. Slowly, his corpse sat up.
"Ellie,"
he whispered. His voice sounded weak and far away, like an echo coming up through a narrow cave. I tried to pull away, but he was just too strong.
"Your brother, Timmy, is here in hell with me."
I sobbed.
"He wants you to know something,"
he continued in an unholy reverberation, staring through me with no eyes to focus.
"He says that it's your fault he's here, and that if you ever left him, you'll come down to burn with the rest of us. Every second hurts so much that he wishes he'd never been born."
He hissed at me. Then he fell to the table, once again, quite dead. I pulled my arm from his cooling fingers and stumbled into the hallway. Tears were brewing like storm clouds, slow but thick and angry. I could sense the heavy, dewy heat and charged tension behind my eyes, and I could feel my breaking point drawing closer, inevitable and inorexable. I looked up and saw her across from me in the hallway. No one else was present. Dr. Skrutt was staring me down like a rival at the OK Corral. I knew that this moment needed to break something wide open so that this terrible seed could spread its unholy tendrils across the blurred lines that divided this hospital from my own thoughts. Tears and words poured involuntarily from my face. Sam Brutson, Myron Caldwell, Jim Dorian, and Cassie Endelman all died tonight, Dr. Skrutt. What is going on at St. Francis? She drew her lips into a thin white line. To be honest, I expected you to be first, Ellie Ophalis. She folded her arms. I folded mine. Rule 9, verbatim, now. The morgue must house at least 13 cadavers at all times, I responded without thinking. The ghost of a smirk brushed past her lips, which she quickly hid. Dr. Dorian did not respect his obligation when I needed him to rise to the occasion during Dr. Brutson's unwellness. This hospital can give life, Dr. Ophalis, and it can take away, but never without meaning. Dr. Skrutt took a deep breath. Unfortunately for Dr. Dorian, he chose to violate the rules when the morgue had only 12 residents. The crooked scales have a way of balancing themselves, and we never have the final judgment. I wanted to fire back, to tell her that she was incorrect, to explain all the things she had overlooked because the world had jaded her inaccurate and unfair judgment. It felt very clear that she was maliciously wrong, but when I opened my mouth to speak, not a single word found its way out. Dr. Skrutt nodded slowly. There are some things we shouldn't see, but have to face. Are you ready? Yes, I snapped. No, child, you're not. All of the dead people you named were smarter and better educated than you. Given the consequences that they've all suffered, do you realize what's at stake? Unable to find my voice, I nodded. She rolled her eyes. Human reproduction is driven mostly by stupidity, and the only reason we've made it this far is because our idiotic desire to kill ourselves is slightly outpaced by our idiotic need to engineer unplanned pregnancies. She rubbed her temple. Now, if you're going to have an emotional breakdown, please make it happen now. It's kinder to send you out the door with broken dreams weighing down an inadequate mind than with a room temperature body weighing down an overused gurney. I had no idea what to say, so I stayed in place. She shook her head. Brighter minds than yours have failed at half of what you want to accomplish. Why are you still here, Dr. Ophalis? I brushed away a tear. Maybe you feel it's unfair that the past has changed you, so you want to change the past? My breath hitched. Every doctor wants to be a vanguard between life and death, but we know that the latter wins eventually. Why are you here? I shook my head. I can't change the past, I whispered. All I have are myself and the present. One of us is going to control the other. I wiped my nose, wiped my eyes, and wished I had done things in the opposite order. She turned crisply around and walked away. I followed without instruction. We stopped in an ordinary part of an ordinary hallway that I had passed dozens of times before. The funny thing, though, is that nothing is ordinary. I stood flabbergasted as I stared at a door that had not existed before that moment. Dr. Skrutt would not look at the edifice. She instead stood next to it, staring at me in harsh judgment. It's too late to ask if you understand what I'm about to tell you, so I'll say my part and then leave you with your choices. No ordinary person can be a doctor, and no ordinary doctor can survive at St. Francis. The wisest choice would be to walk away right now and pursue a long life of predictability and oblivious joy, only to return decades later with the false hope that death is an option. I've done everything in my power to warn you about moving forward from this point, because you won't like what you see at the end of the path. She narrowed her eyes at me. If you choose not to give up, that's on you. Then she turned and walked briskly away from me. I tried, and failed, to steady my shaking breath. I knew that I would go through the door in the same way I knew I would get out of bed every morning. There was only one way forward. Slowly, I looked up at the door that had not been real outside this point in time. Etched in its ancient wood was a number, 1913. I'd memorized the rules at this point, but it no longer mattered. Barely containing my nausea, I reached out a feeble hand and turned the knob. It opened easily, almost lovingly. I swallowed and nodded. The faint smell of smoke invaded my nostrils as I stepped forward. I told myself I could handle whatever was in there. I was wrong. I changed my mind about opening the door as soon as I touched it, and tried to go back right as the latch clicked shut. It wouldn't reopen, of course, but I still wasted my time trying. I shut my eyes to hold in the tears and keep out the burn. St. Francis was an impossible place, and many of the things I'd seen this night defied everything I had believed about reality. But what I felt on the other side of this door stretched my mind like bubblegum. I imagined a fat, drooling man chewing on my brain with a fierce, angry gnashing that squished the gray matter carelessly between the clean, white teeth. This couldn't be. The cicadas proved me wrong. They sang a ceaseless, screeching hymn that pressed against my senses with aggression only matched by the weighty humidity of a hot Missouri summer. I knew that once I opened my eyes, I would see the blood-red cardinal flowers dancing lazily in the midday sun, showing no concern for the blood-red fire voraciously consuming my childhood home. I opened my eyes at the scream. There was no doubt of its origin. I knew that a 12-year-old Ellie Phalis was about to run out of the roasting structure, her shirt burning hot enough to consume her dermis and leave a very ugly, very permanent mark on her tiny body. I instantly realized that she couldn't see me. Her terrified eyes pleaded for help but found no one. She was a smart girl, so she knew to hit the ground and roll furiously until her burning shirt had been extinguished. She would be unable to peel it off, however, as the smoldering polyester slowly ate its way onto grafted skin. Removing the garment was not her concern, though. She leapt to her feet and wheeled around to stare at the burning edifice, too terrified to re-enter, too mortified to walk away.
"Timmy!"
she screamed.
"I'm sorry I told you to fuck off. You have to get out of your room. Timmy!"
The burning house belched a fresh tongue of flame, and she stepped back. The scream came from upstairs.
"I know you can hear me. You have to get out of the house, now." "Ellie?"
His voice was meek, but it oozed more terror than should have been possible.
"I don't know how to get out. You have to help me."
The young girl froze.
"Please come help me, Ellie. I'm sorry I stole your computer. I'm sorry. Please get me out of here. It's getting really hot, and I think the fire's coming into my bedroom soon."
She sobbed, but said nothing. Then she closed her eyes and charged into the house. One foot had crossed the threshold before she turned and jumped back out, holding her arms over her face.
"You have to get yourself out, Timmy. I can't go in there."
She screamed to the second-story window.
"Yes, you can, Ellie. Please, my door is on fire. No one else is home. You have to come get me."
She began weeping openly now. Deep, guttural sobs racked her frail body as she took several steps away from the house.
"Timmy, you have to jump. I'm so sorry, but I can't help you. It's not that far to the ground. I can't jump. I can't. Ellie, there's fire inside my room. No!"
She doubled over, then stepped back farther.
"Please jump. You can go back in the door, Ellie. Go around to my other side. My bed is on fire. It's too hot."
Her jaw quivered.
I can't go back in the door, Timothy."
She responded in a much lower voice.
"Yes, you can." "I'm too scared."
She trailed off.
"I'm burning and it hurts."
She crumpled to the ground and buried her face in her hands. Young Ellie stayed like that for a long time, but Timothy said nothing more. The north wing of the house collapsed just as firefighters arrived. The first engine was understaffed. No matter how many times they yelled at her, no one could spare a moment to physically pull the distraught girl away. So she watched as they subdued and contained the fire.
My brother's in the house,"
she whispered. They were professional firefighters, but not therapists, and they dove in to rescue him without a second thought for their own safety or her need for comfort. She grabbed the last one before he ran away from her.
"Over there,"
she instructed in a barely audible voice as she pointed to the wreckage of the north wing. He responded without acknowledging her, racing to pull apart the smoking rubble of the boards and glass that she had once called home.
Johnny, Roy, call a fucking ambulance now!
He threw aside the blackened wood of my broken house and stopped cold. Then he bent over and threw up. I wanted to tell the young girl to stop walking, To turn away and spend a life wondering how terrible death could be instead of confirming that the worst of our assumptions is true. But I knew that she would not have listened to me, even if I had been able to influence this world. So she drifted onward, pushed less by curiosity than by the dreamlike state of obligation that drives the vast majority of every action we will ever take. I knew the sensations would hit her in stages. That's what roasting human meat smells like. Followed by, I can hear him moaning, he's still alive. And right on its heels, I've never heard a person dying, but I'm certain that's what's unfolding before me. Then, all at once, came the visual. I found that I had been unconsciously following in her footsteps, as unable to turn away as it was impossible to affect the ghost who didn't see me. She and I arrived at the firefighters simultaneously, both looking into the ruins of our life at the exact same destructive moment. Nothing was left of Timmy's skin. Even after my years in medicine, I still would not have realized that the pile of human meat below me was a 6-year-old human without prior knowledge of that fact. His lips had been burned away, so every tooth was exposed to the outside world. The char that covered most of his body looked like a combination of rare steak and popped zits. But it was his eyes that drew me in the most. Without lids, they stared fixedly into the sky as though brazenly expecting a god to care and staring in horrified shock at what he saw looking back. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. It was much quieter than the memory implanted on my 12-year-old mind. Looking back, I had always believed that it was a gale-strength holler, one that announced to anyone who doubted that I was thoroughly guilty. Watching it for the second time, however, proved it to be a meek, gurgling, sad cry that could only have been emitted by a creature far too frail to understand the concept of death. The sobbing clashed with my memory. I had pictured myself collapsing into a heap and moaning softly, utterly too broken to weep. It took several seconds to realize that I was crying, there in the past present, surrounded by people, but totally alone. I stumbled forward, clambering over the broken wood in an effort to get closer to what remained of my brother. I don't know what drove my actions, but none of us know what steers our purest motives. My foot caught on a stray board, and I landed face to face with his corpse. I heaved, but I had to speak.
I'm sorry.
I whispered to the memory.
Every day since this one has been spent regretting what I failed to do. It's why I'm a doctor. But the past doesn't go away.
I drew in a shuddering breath.
Please just tell me you loved me, even as you hated me.
I knew that he was dead, but did not understand the rules of the world beyond 1913. So I hoped. That hope was fulfilled when my brother rotated his head. For the first time, another person acknowledged my presence here.
Go through the door, Ellie.
I gasped and blinked. When I opened my eyes again, he was staring upward once more, very clearly dead. Had I imagined his instructions? Hell, was I imagining everything? I turned to look back at the shattered little girl. She was curled into a ball, eyes wide open and mouth gasping like a fish, needing with all of her being to be held and loved by absolutely anyone, and finding nothing. I knew that the mental trauma was burning its way into her neurons, just like the melting shirt was dissolving the mid-layer of her skin, breaking it down cell by cell with each tick of the second hand, leaving indelible scars that would forever seek healing that no doctor could ever provide. I left her there. I stood, swaying, unsure of where to go, but somehow certain that the path would find a way to present itself to me. I stumbled my way out of the burning rubble. I moved from the heat into the light, and I stood in the front yard that I had not seen in 14 years. I'd always been happy there, which is why I never went back. The door in the middle of the yard was new. It stood impossibly in the middle of the lawn, coming from nowhere and leading nowhere. I was quite certain that I was the only one who could see it because it was meant just for me. I stumbled, I walked, and then I moved confidently toward the knob, grasping it, accepting that I was broken, but not completely so. I nodded to myself. Then I turned the handle, opened it wide, and stepped forward. I was met by the smell of smoke. The whine of cicadas hit me next, followed by the thudding of the door as it closed behind me. I shut my eyes tight as the blood-red fire voraciously consuming my childhood home glowed through my lids, unwilling to accept my next step in the path that only pretended to care about my opinion. I opened my eyes at the screen. I watched again, helplessly, as the 12-year-old version of myself endured the type of pain that adults fool themselves into thinking they can deny their children. I watched my little brother burn. I saw more of his body this time. The initial shock gave way to an unrelentingly critical doctor's eye. His charred vertebrae and demolished spinal cord spilled disgustingly onto the ground like discarded butcher's offal. I realized vaguely that Timmy must have landed on his neck, bursting his destroyed innards and his barbecued skin shredded from the impact of the collapsing house. It broke more of me than I had thought possible. Deep fissures cleaved my mind in ways that I once would have believed impossible to endure. But I left the broken pieces of me on the road, and found that I could travel lighter once there was less of me to carry. It was, to be honest, brutally efficient. In that moment, I understood how the world could change a person into a quintessential shit bitch, and in becoming stronger, I was able to make it through the journey yet again, this time confidently grasping the door on the other side, now more whole because there was less of my spirit. Smoke hit me first, followed by the warm humidity of an old Missouri summer. And of course, there was the scream. I collapsed on the ground, unable to move any farther. I got up, of course, because what else was there to do? I had to choose between moving on and spending the rest of my life completely immobile. I was not going to allow the location of fate's arbitrary decision to determine the rest of my years. So I stood and I moved. I endured everything again, and I discovered just how much of myself could be broken while still moving forward. I arrived at the end. I opened the door, and I walked into the scream. I once heard that the trees in West Texas are shaped by winds that rip across the open plains. The constant pressure warps them in time, no matter how great the tree. It is permanently marred by a world that would never relent. The original design of the plant becomes unsalvageable, and the brokenness evolves into an inedible part of the tree's character. It can never hope to become what it had once intended. But still, the tree grows. It was easier to travel without the burden of hope, so I discarded the last vestiges upon the seventh opening, and casually found my way into Dr. Skrutt's office. "Close the door behind you," she ordered. I obeyed out of practicality and stood before her. "Well," she regarded me over her thin spectacles, "are you going to have a long cry about it and then talk about what happened? Or will you be skipping the part that has no practical value so we don't waste any more of my time?" I sat in the chair across from her. "I've exhausted every tear," I responded simply. "Good," she shot back. "I hope that fact lightened your burden." I almost asked her why she was so mean, but silenced myself. People only change if they want to change. I had no desire to quarrel with facts that didn't care if I believed in them. She eyed me carefully. "You never told all of the story because you were afraid of what people would say." I nodded. My mind was so completely stretched, shocked, used, that I had nothing left to offer but stark practicality. "How did you know?" She looked sad. "Because, Dr. Phalis, that's everyone's story." I stared at her blankly. She sighed. "Each one of us is ashamed about some part of our past. We believe that keeping it a secret allows us to control the thing that is beyond our grasp. This stems from the fact that people are idiots." I had no response. "Letting go of the false belief means controlling the past, Ellie. At least to some small extent, that we still can. You're not losing by dropping the illusion." I took a deep breath. "I feel like admitting it makes you a shitty person." "Yes, I know," she responded with a roll of her eyes. "But admitting the truth does not make you a shitty person. It's what you did that makes you shitty." She flared her nostrils and was silent. Without neither preamble nor permission, I began my explanation. "Timmy and I had been fighting. I heaved. I just received a new laptop. Since I was 12 and he was 6, I got many of the things that Timmy wanted but couldn't have. I gloated when he cried because it made me feel like I had more. My dad was a janitor and we couldn't afford most of what I thought I needed, so when I finally got the laptop I knew I deserved, I taunted my brother worse than I had ever before. I drew a deep, shuddering breath. So he stole it when I wasn't looking and locked himself into my bedroom. I'd never, ever been so angry. I actually told him to fuck off, which was the first time I'd ever said those words. His favorite stuffed animal, this ridiculous, oversized bear, was left unguarded in his bed, so I stole it, yelled across the house that I was going to destroy it, and ran downstairs. I buried my face in my hands. I threw it on the stove and turned on the pilot light, and I was so happy when it finally caught fire. Timmy ran into the kitchen just as the flames engulfed his bear. I saw just how deeply I'd hurt him, deeper than he'd ever felt, and I was overjoyed. The pain I had caused my brother seemed so good in that moment, and I don't know why, but I was sure he deserved it. I paused. Then I continued, because there was nothing else to do. He told me he was going to throw my laptop out the window, that he would lock himself in my room and smash it to pieces on the ground. Then he turned and ran. I cleared my throat. So I grabbed the stuffed bear's leg, which was dangling off the edge of the stove and not yet burning, and hurled it at him. I pursed my lips and nodded solemnly to myself. Why does any 12-year-old make a decision other than because it seemed like a good idea at the time? I didn't plan on having the bear hit the wall and land in the trash can, and I had no idea how quickly a garbage fire could spread through the kitchen. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. But I was old enough to weigh my options. I knew that I had enough time to get up the stairs, but probably not back down again, because the fire had consumed half the kitchen in under 20 seconds. I drew several shallow breaths. I also knew that I could exit through the kitchen's back door to immediate safety. More shallow breaths. I had to make a practical decision in a split second, and I was still angry in that split second. Angry at my brother, but also at myself, though I was too young to understand it at the time. I swallowed. It would be so much easier to say that it was either all cold practicality or else all hot vengeance. I reasoned like a child, but was mature enough to understand what my decision meant. The reality is that both concepts pulled my mind across a twisted landscape of opposing ideas, eschewing the decency of being all one thing or all of another. I dropped my hands to my side and stared unwaveringly at Dr. Skrutt. I decided to turn my back and run outside. I remember every part of that choice. It shattered my heart and my mind badly enough that I know I'll never be whole again. I took one more long breath. But each day I hurt a little more because I can't stop thinking of what I would do if I could go back, and I know that I would probably still make the same choice. For the first time that I could remember, she broke eye contact first. "Ellie," she sighed. "Why do you think that St. Francis Hospital would have such an arbitrary set of rules for its interns?" I responded without emotion. "The rules come from somewhere beyond us. I understand that now. We're just here to follow them." She looked sad. Then slowly, Dr. Skrutt shook her head. "No, Dr. Phalis, that isn't true." She rubbed her eyes. "What was the first rule? Never, under any circumstances, share your copy of the rules with anyone else," I replied robotically. She raised an eyebrow. "And how does that make any sense?" I stumbled as I tried to remember the words. It was important to see. Not all of us were going to make it." "That much is true," she responded dismissively. "We've seen more than enough evidence of that tonight. But you're wrong about the rule coming from somewhere else." She stared pointedly across her desk at me. I stared back. "I don't understand." "Then you're starting to get it," she shot back. "You weren't top of your class, Dr. Phalis, not even close, but you're at least smart enough to be a doctor. Can you attempt to figure this out?" I quickly calculated the odds of making an ass of myself in ratio to the probability of answering correctly. and remained silent. She shook her head in disappointment. Did you really never make the connections, Dr. Phalis? The trial of jumping off a roof, judgment from an authoritative janitor, multiple different rules about burning children. My jaw fell. The first rule prohibits the sharing of rules because no one has the same set. Each doctor is faced with his or her own list of restrictions, and most aren't up to the challenge. I struggled to find the words. Every rule is just for me? Dr. Skrutt removed her glasses. People think that this hospital wants to destroy them, when in reality, each person is given every tool needed for survival. She snorted. It's impossible to stop most individuals' desire to kill themselves. I stared at her desk in shock. But, Rule 4, why did it tell me not to touch your Reese's peanut butter cups? She stared at me like I'd been caught masturbating in a fish tank. Because it's my favorite candy. I nodded slowly. Mine, too. Dr. Skrutt placed the glasses back on her head. You're going to ask what this place is, she continued slowly. I've survived St. Francis far longer than most. That's why people expect me to tell them. She paused, choosing each of her words very carefully. So before you say that you want me to tell you the truth, you should understand this fact. Here, she bored her eyes into mine, and this time, it was me who turned away early. There are things that I can't know and things that I don't know. Embracing these ideas as a strength instead of a weakness is the reason I've endured where others have not. We were quiet for some time. Can you see the individual rules on each doctor's paper? I asked suddenly. She smirked. No, but I can see what's written on their faces, which is the same thing. I don't get it, I responded honestly. She sighed in disappointment. Do you remember when I reminded you of Rule 9? I thought back to our conversation just after Dr. Dorian had died. You told me the morgue needed 13 cadavers at all times, I replied confidently. No, she shot back. You told me that. I acted like I had known the entire time, and you responded to my confidence. Each person's list of rules is their own battle to fight. To be blunt, I'd rather see the doctors fail themselves through inadequacy than see the patients suffer because someone was unable to live up to their own unearned arrogance. I blinked. I'd like to earn my arrogance, I said. Dr. Skrutt smiled. The good news is that I think you might have endurance to survive the unusually lengthy journey it would take for you to achieve earned arrogance. The door burst open before I could say anything more. I said nothing as a familiar janitor walked confidently to Dr. Skrutt's office. For the first time, I heard him speak.
3 children have been dead for 119 minutes. 13 people are not in the morgue, and Dr. Falhar ignored me when I tried to stop him from stealing Dr. Gralt's list.
Dr. Skrutt stood, and I followed suit. Wait, Dr. Skrutt, please. I looked at her in desperation. She gave me a look that told me I had 1/4 of a second to speak. Is this real? She looked away and walked around her desk. Death is real. Nothing else is guaranteed. Doctors are tasked with delaying the inevitable and embracing the fact that 100% of our efforts will eventually fail. I walked briskly after her as she followed the janitor out of her office. If death is the only real thing, then this life is a place where impossible things can happen. Stop doubting that fact. Now, grab the sulfuric acid. We're going to attempt to prevent your fellow interns from killing each other or any of the patients.